This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 21st chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, Jesus said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." They asked him, "Teacher, when will this be? And what will be the sign that this is about to take place?" And he said, "Beware that you are not led astray. For many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and 'the time is near.' Do not go after them. When you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately." Then he said to them, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, and in various places famines and plagues. There will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be betrayed even by parents and brothers, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance, you will gain your souls." The Gospel of the Lord. So Jesus clearly was not a politician. Today's Gospel reading, coming as it always does in mid-November around our election cycle, makes that abundantly clear. Jesus and his disciples have recently arrived in Jerusalem and were walking around the temple complex. It was a big and impressive place and a tourist destination even in the first century. The disciples remarked to Jesus that they are really impressed with this place, especially how beautiful and glorious it all is. Now, a good politician, somebody looking to create and sustain a following, would say something like, "As for these things that you see, they are nothing like the glory that I'm about to bring about. Just wait, you ain't seen nothing yet." But instead, Jesus starts talking about how all this stuff is about to come crashing down. He speaks about wars, insurrections, famines, earthquakes, and plagues. But wait, says Jesus, we're not done yet. Before all that happens, they're going to arrest you, persecute you, and even kill some of you. These are just not the words that you use to win friends and influence people. It's not a recommended way to win a following, and it's certainly not going to make you popular enough to win the next election. In other places, Jesus at least has some more hopeful words to talk about the age to come. And even if people are experiencing these horrible things in their lives, what most of us would like to hear is, well, frankly, more like what St. Paul wrote to the Romans, where he says, "I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us." That's what I want to hear. That's what I want to tell others. But at least in today's gospel reading, Jesus doesn't say anything like that. Instead, he ends his gloom and doom analysis with a call to endurance. By your endurance, you will gain your souls. At first glance, that doesn't sound very helpful or hopeful either. After all, most of us usually hear the call to endurance as the equivalent to saying, "Tough it out, suck it up, good luck, you're on your own." But it's clear from the context that this isn't what Jesus means. For sure, this is a call to action on the part of the disciples. But it's also clear that the endurance to which Jesus calls his disciples is different from what we might first expect when we hear that word. In fact, the kind of endurance to which Jesus called his first disciples is based on nurturing a relationship with God. That is, if the disciples are to endure any of these terrible things in their lives, they really need to not only expect, but rely on God's constant presence and help in their lives. In the midst of all this really scary stuff about being arrested and dragged before kings and governors, Jesus says not to prepare a defense, because he himself will give them the words to speak. And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't prepare for difficult experiences, but it does mean that they should rely on the constant help of Jesus to enable them to endure. Jesus really will be with them. Jesus is going to give them the words, and they should not try to go it alone. And also, this kind of endurance that Jesus called his first disciples is based on sticking together with each other. It's not entirely clear from the English translation, but throughout this whole discourse, Jesus says you in the plural. That is, you together. Your endurance together is what makes the difference. Often, people hear the word endurance as a call to individual effort. But here, Jesus makes it clear that not only do the disciples need the help and presence of God to endure, but that endurance also necessitates sticking together and supporting each other. And this call to endurance of Jesus means that his disciples are to look for opportunities, even and especially in difficult times. Jesus says that when his disciples are dragged before people who may want to kill them, that this will give them an opportunity. I'm sure that many of the people that heard him say this would think, gee, Jesus, thanks, but that is not the kind of opportunity that I was looking for here. And yet, very often the most important times to look for and recognize opportunities are in situations of conflict and distress. And Jesus makes it clear that endurance requires watching for the opportunities to be faithful and not simply for opportunities to duck and cover. Now, I suspect that one of the reasons Jesus talked about endurance, rather than giving hopeful visions of heaven, was because Jesus had just led his disciples into Jerusalem on what we call Holy Week. Jesus himself was about to be arrested, dragged before governors and kings, and killed. And even after his resurrection, life for his disciples was often going to be difficult and painful. Moreover, the world into which he sent them was, like our world, going to be filled in a place of wars and insurrections, famines and earthquakes and plagues and all of that kind of stuff that is still part of our world today. And Luke wrote it all down in his gospel, in spite of it being a downer, because Jesus' disciples in every age, including ours, need to know that Jesus didn't come just to give us a happy vision of heaven sometime in the age to come. Instead, Jesus calls us also to endure in a hard and difficult world. But Jesus also promises us his presence and help to give us strength to endure. And so Jesus calls us also to the kind of endurance which is found through constantly nurturing our relationship with God. The kind of endurance Jesus calls us to isn't about toughing it out by ourselves. It's about relying on God's constant presence and help to get through the difficult times, and it's about nurturing that presence in our lives. And that's why, at least for me, being together in worship, taking time for prayer, and practicing listening for God's guidance in my life are the keys to helping me endure the mess that often surrounds me. And that's one of the reasons that being together in worship is so important. It helps us connect and deepen our relationship with God every day so that we can have the strength and confidence to be able to go out into the world and endure all the stuff that's going on out there. It's not supposed to be an escape from what's happening. And that's important because I think in our world and in our society today, for so many people, spirituality is often understood to be an escape from the mess. Let me find a way to kind of escape into myself and pretend it's all not going on. But the kind of endurance that Jesus calls us, the kind of relationship he calls us to have with God, is a kind of relationship in which God meets us in the midst of the messes and the chaos and, frankly, some of the ugliness of life, so that we have the strength to endure, to move forward, and to share with others. Endurance that Jesus calls us to is not a way of escaping for a while, but rather a way of constantly looking for ways to be faithful instead of looking for a way to duck and cover. The kind of endurance that Jesus calls us to is also a kind of endurance which calls us to stick together. And one of the things that many of us realized when we had to stay apart during COVID was that even routine problems were harder to deal with when we had to deal with them by ourselves, or when we felt alone and like nobody else was there with us. Jesus always called his disciples to stick together. He sent them out in pairs. He told them to follow him as a group, not as individuals. And he told them here that one of the keys to endurance was to deal with the messes together. And that's one of the reasons our congregation's leadership has been looking lately at ways to help us develop, maintain, and in fact, reconnect with each other in this community that we share. And it was one of the reasons that we decided, we could have, and we've done this sometimes in Advent, we could have just had an evening prayer service at 7:15 and everybody comes and worships and goes home. And we said, no, you know what, we're gonna have a time of fellowship where we gather together, not just because we like wine and finger food and stuff like that, because we need that time to be together. We need to be able to actually strengthen and build community with each other. That is as important to endurance as the time to actually worship God and build our relationship with God. Those are the things that we're looking to try to do, and I was reflecting on that recently with somebody in the congregation where I said, back when we had only online worship, and it was really weird because I would stand here and I would preach the sermon and all I would see is the camera up there. I would see nobody around me, which is a really weird experience. But when we would all watch it together and we would see other people online, I felt connected to those folks. But I felt connected to people like you guys because I know you. I've been together with you. And when you have the experience of actually being together, then some of the virtual stuff, it makes a difference in your lives. Kind of like, as we get ready for Thanksgiving and Christmas, we may end up seeing family and friends that we maybe only see once or twice a year. But when we have those experiences of being together help us to be able to feel that connection throughout the rest of the year. And that gives us the ability sometimes to endure some of the struggles and the ability for those folks and for us to support one another even when we're apart. Living together in real-life community isn't simply a nice idea that Jesus lifts up. It's a calling through which Jesus gives us strength to endure the messes and the hardships which often surrounds us. And that is the reason that Jesus says always you plural, you together, are the key to part of the way that you endure. And for us too, looking for opportunities is part of what endurance means, maybe especially too, in difficult moments. Indeed, many of the opportunities that Jesus calls us to are always right in front of us to see. But sometimes we recognize opportunities when things really get tough, when things are bad. People pay attention to those opportunities and those needs. So I remember I like, lots of times I read the financial column that Michelle Singletary writes in the Washington Post, and periodically when interest rates start to raise or things like that happen, she doesn't quite say it like this, but basically says, here are opportunities to help you stay and get out of debt. Maybe now that things are bad, you'll pay attention, because sometimes when things are bad, people pay attention to the opportunities that they really need. And that, I think, is one of the reasons that social justice ministry said, hey, you know what? Things are really bad right now. We've had adopted families before, but now that things are really bad, this is the time for us to look for opportunities to help families. So we adopted 6 families. They're sort of the size of football teams. That's why we all got to help out here. But because we know that there's such need out there, we look for those opportunities. And part of what Jesus says endurance is about looking for opportunities to be faithful and to live our faith even when things are bad. And see, paradoxically, it's sometimes through seeking and finding opportunities to live our faith in difficult moments that we not only help others, but we also end up finding ourselves the strength to endure. Jesus called his first disciples to lives of endurance, and he calls us to live lives of endurance as well. It's hard work, but it is not work that we do alone. Instead, the endurance to which Jesus calls us is based on the promise of Jesus' continual help and presence in our lives, which we're called to nurture and live in each day. Jesus' call to endurance is always based on sticking together and nurturing the community into which Jesus calls us. And Jesus' call to endurance is always based on being open to the guidance of the Holy Spirit in our lives, which helps us to see opportunities, even and especially in times of deep distress, through which we can share hope with others and find strength to endure.